She was on a date with her lover. She didn't realize her aunt had barged in. Thérèse rushed her lover up her skirt. Then she pretended to be resting. She didn't realize that her aunt's arrival had aroused her lover's desire. He made a little move under the dress. This caused Thérèse to make an indescribable face. The aunt thought Thérèse was not feeling well, so she gave Thérèse a massage. At this point, Thérèse couldn't say no to her aunt. She could only force herself to suppress her excitement. Thérèse was enjoying herself so much under her hands. The aunt was even proud that she was actually very good at it. She didn't realize that it was the lover in Thérèse's dress who was really good. Young and beautiful, Thérèse was forced to marry a physically weak and uninteresting man. Until one day, the repressed Thérèse met the man of her dreams. It's a pity that the appearance of this man is both her luck and the disaster she cannot escape. The story takes place in 19th century France. Thérèse's father was a sea captain. He was always busy in Africa. Thérèse's mother had just died, and her father was too busy to take care of her. So he left Thérèse with his sister, Madame Raquin. Thérèse's father sent them a little money every month, but he never showed up again. At the time, her aunt had a son, Camille, who had been sick for years and was very weak. Perhaps it was because he was weak. Raquin was very fond of him. She even let Thérèse share a room with Camille, to take care of Camille. And so the years went by. Both of them had grown up. Thérèse was young and beautiful and graceful. Camille was thin and pale. He was still sickly and frail. One day Thérèse overheard a farmer mowing his lawn. The farmer's strong body made Thérèse's heart flutter. The fire of desire began to burn. It was as if an electric current ran through her body. When she saw Camille, she suddenly asked Camille to kiss her. But Camille and Thérèse had lived together since they were kids, and now he had nothing but affection for Thérèse. There was no trace of that kind of desire. Thérèse was very disappointed. Camille was clearly not her ideal lover. That same day, Thérèse received news that his father had died in a shipwreck. Thérèse lost her financial resources and her hope for the future. So when Aunt Raquin asked her to marry Camille, Thérèse was reluctant in every way, but she couldn't find the strength or the courage to refuse. Now she was alone and dependent on her aunt and Camille. They married and moved to Paris. Camille found a job in a company with the help of a close friend of her mother's. The house they rented was right on the street. Raquin also planned to open a store to help support his family. The house was in a narrow alley. It was as dark and damp as a cellar. It was as bleak and depressing as Thérèse's life was right now. Camille was weak and new. He was often bullied at work. He often went to the zoo by himself. He's like a child who never grows up, and he had no interest in what happened between husband and wife. It made Thérèse feel like a widow. Then one day Camille brought in a man named Laurent. Laurent had been Camille's childhood friend. Now he worked for Camille's company. The man was handsome and loved to paint. He's a bit cynical at heart. Laurent has always wanted to be a painter. Then Camille asked Laurent to do a portrait of him. That's why Laurent frequented Thérèse's house. Laurent's personality was flamboyant. His words were a bit sensational and dared to say anything. He even talked about his sexual encounters in front of Thérèse. Every sensitive word tugged at Thérèse's heartstrings. I don't know if it was intentional or not. He drew Camille as a man who was weak and gloomy, with hemorrhoids on his face. But Camille loved it. They thought Laurent was a genius, because it really showed Camille's soul. That's what art is supposed to do. At the same time, Thérèse's desires were unknowingly ignited by Laurent. Laurent knew women very well. He could see Thérèse's inner depression right away. From then on, the two of them began to see each other in secret, and enjoying the pleasure of relaxation. Thérèse's eyes began to glow, as if her life had just begun. Her relationship with her husband Camille began to drift apart. Thérèse would rather sit on the edge of her bed all night than sleep next to her husband, because her relationship with Laurent was no longer about physical pleasure. They had fallen in love with each other, and it was getting stronger, and they became more and more inseparable. After a while, Camille suddenly decided to return to the countryside. The conditions in Paris made him very ill. Thérèse, of course, did not want to leave. She urged her husband to stay in Paris for the sake of his work and the store. But Camille's mind was made up. He said in the tone of the head of the family, "This is an order, and not a request for advice." Thérèse was now in a state of anxiety. She went to Laurent in the night. Now Thérèse would rather die than lose him. But Laurent had an idea. He wanted to kill Camille by accident. Thérèse was shocked by Laurent's words. She neither agreed nor refused. But now the only thing she knew for sure, she and Laurent could never be separated. One day, out of the blue, Camille gave Thérèse a flower. It was the first time Camille had ever been so romantic. Thérèse was surprised. The three of them went on a picnic. Camille was tired of walking. He lay down on top of Thérèse to rest for a while. Camille's behavior made Laurent very jealous, and his desire to kill grew stronger and stronger. Then Camille suggested that the three of them go boating on the lake. Thérèse was hesitant to get on the boat. She thought Laurent had made up his mind. If she got in the boat, Camille would be in trouble. But after a mental struggle, Thérèse agreed to Laurent's decision. At that moment, the urge to defend her love overcame Thérèse's conscience and reason. On this beautiful lake, a murder is brewing. As the boat moved into less populated waters, there was no turning back. Shortly thereafter, a cacophony of shouts shattered the peace. There was an accident on the boat. Only Laurent and Thérèse survived. Laurent had a serious story to tell afterward. When the boat capsized, Camille told him to save Thérèse first. By the time he got to Thérèse, Camille had sunk to the bottom of the river. People were convinced it was a sad accident. Thérèse was now distraught. Laurent could only reassure Thérèse to pull herself together. Otherwise, all would be lost. Madame Raquin was devastated by the news of her son's death. It was as if the sky had fallen. Then the search went on. They finally found Camille's body. After seeing Camille's decomposing body, Laurent was sick to his stomach. When Camille was buried, the barriers between Thérèse and Laurent were no longer there. But they were not happy. Instead, they were tormented by their sins, especially Thérèse. Seeing her aunt cry all day long, she was in a trance. She felt even more guilty. And sometimes Raquin would go into a frenzy, berating Thérèse. Why Thérèse survived and not her son. Thérèse blamed herself for Raquin's questions, but she couldn't tell the truth. And afterward, Raquin felt bad about it too. She said she was just grieving too much and lost her mind. From that moment on, the family lost all joy and was overcome with sadness. Thérèse started having nightmares. The scene on the lake kept coming back to her. She became extremely sensitive. To avoid suspicion, Thérèse and Laurent had been seeing less and less of each other lately. And when they did see each other, Thérèse and Laurent didn't even want to enjoy it. Because Thérèse was blaming herself, she even asked Laurent why he had to kill Camille. Laurent had to reassure Thérèse that at least they'd be together for a long time. Luckily, Raquin had always loved her son's best friend, Laurent. At this point in time, on the advice of others, Raquin decided to marry Thérèse to Laurent. She even made a will leaving the store and other assets to both of them. She had already lost her son. Thérèse and Laurent were the only two people who could provide for her now that she had lost her son. Naturally, Thérèse and Laurent were very happy. A new life was finally beginning to beckon, but it wasn't that simple. Raquin had Camille's painting hung in his bedroom. Thérèse felt horrible and guilty every time she saw Camille's face. Laurent still has the scar on his neck. That's from Camille's struggle before he died. Both the scar and the portrait became a nightmare for both of them. Thérèse suddenly realized she couldn't be with Laurent the way she used to be. The scene on the lake always came back to her. Laurent waving his oar. Camille's death throes. Those horrible images surrounded her like ghosts. Thérèse's life was overshadowed. These elements even became the tone of her life. And Raquin's mental health began to deteriorate. She began to suffer from the loss of her son, and even saw her son's face regularly, and felt the pain of his death. In the midst of her intense mental anguish, Raquin suddenly suffered a stroke and collapsed. She became bedridden. From then on, the couple had to take on the responsibility of caring for their aunt. And so it was for some time. Laurent's painting ambitions were still not fulfilled. He suffered from a paralyzed Raquin and a sometimes neurotic Thérèse. A life that was the opposite of what they had envisioned. There was no happiness at all, especially Thérèse. She would sometimes blurt out stories about killing people in the lake, and the two of them started to fight a lot. They blamed each other for Camille's death. During an argument, Raquin overheard them talking. The truth finally came out. Luckily, Raquin was paralyzed and unable to speak. They didn't make things difficult for the aunt. But then, at a party, Raquin tried to write with her weak hand. She wanted to write that Thérèse and Laurent had killed her son. But when all that came out was Thérèse and Laurent's names, she didn't have the strength to continue. Friends didn't know the truth. They thought Raquin meant to thank Thérèse and Laurent for taking care of her. And even though they got away with it, Thérèse was more and more worried. She was afraid that one day her and Laurent's crimes would be revealed. Thérèse decided to move out of the neighborhood. She was filled with resentment for Raquin's actions. From the moment Raquin forced her to marry Camille, Thérèse had hated her aunt. The worse life gets, those who can't control their destiny have an instinctive hatred for those who manipulate their destiny. Thérèse blamed her crimes on Raquin's interference. But even so, Thérèse couldn't assuage her guilt. She began to indulge in orgies. She let herself forget her past in a drunken stupor. During this time, her relationship with Laurent deteriorated. She blamed Laurent for what he had done to her life. Whenever she saw Laurent, she felt remorse and anger. Then one day, a friend of Raquin's came to visit and saw what she had written. Thérèse and Laurent had killed Camille. Raquin's friend was so scared, she ran out and called the police. Then Thérèse saw Raquin's writing too. That's when she realized she'd been exposed. Now, Thérèse doesn't blame Raquin at all. Instead, she was filled with guilt and asked for forgiveness. It's all clear now. It won't be long before the police arrive. At this moment, both of them are ready for the final moment. To say goodbye to the world together, they took Raquin to the banks of the Seine. Before they died, Thérèse and Laurent were able to open their hearts one last time. She prepared the knife. Laurent prepared the poison. When they both realized what the other was thinking, they were both much relieved. They were able to be honest with each other for the last time. For the last time, they spoke the words of their hearts. Laurent took the first sip, Then Thérèse took the bottle and drank it all. The two of them curled up together like two wounded waterfowl. No matter what sins or happiness they had in their lives, death takes everything away. And that's the end of the movie. The movie is based on a very famous novel by Zola. Zola wrote in the preface, his novel is an attempt to study the human temperament. In the movie, Thérèse represents melancholy, Laurent represents optimism, Raquin is irritable, and Camille, indifference. Thérèse grew up in the shadows. She's used to being submissive and lacking autonomy. Camille is gentle on the outside, but at heart, he's self-centered. He grew up with a mother who spoiled him. He lacked self-awareness and understanding of others. So all he cared about was his happiness. He never put himself in Thérèse's shoes. Raquin seems like a very nice guy on the outside. She was nice to Thérèse, but in reality, she was very selfish. She always forced Thérèse to marry Camille, and in the end, she made Thérèse marry Laurent. It was all for her own benefit, the selfishness of human nature combined with the repression of her desires. Thérèse's infidelity was almost inevitable, but when she saw Laurent kill Camille, she didn't expect to be so devastated, and Laurent did love Thérèse. But ever since the idea of killing came to him, the end was already in sight. Happiness can't come from a life of sin. They had to pay the debt with their lives.